Welcome, everyone. It is so nice to have you joining us today. My name is Cara Robichev. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Deputy Director and Network Manager at Energy Action Network, and I'm happy to welcome you to this EAN webinar on our latest research paper, Fossil Fuel Sales in Vermont, What the Latest Data Mean for the State Economy, Vermont Consumers, and Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Commitments. Next slide. So I'm starting by giving you a very brief overview of what EAN is for any of you who don't know. So EAN is really two things. We are a broad network of people who are working together to achieve Vermont's climate and energy commitments in ways that create a more just, thriving, and sustainable future. And that network is made up of folks who work in the public sector, who work for utilities, higher education, businesses, nonprofits, and NGOs. And then the second thing that EAN is a small organization with 3 staff, Jared and Lena and I, who are all on this call. And our mission is to ensure that Vermont's energy and climate decisions are evidence-based, grounded in high-quality data and analysis, and collaboratively developed for effective and durable progress. So one of the big things that we do to serve that mission is that we pull together the best available data and analysis to share with our network and with the state of Vermont. One of the main ways we do that is through our annual progress report for Vermont on emissions, energy, equity, and the economy, which we're working on, and we'll be releasing the 2025 report in the fall. And then the other thing that we do is additional research and reports like the one we'll be reporting on today. So before I pass over to Jared and he dives into the analysis, I wanted to just go over a couple of logistics. There's a lot that Jared would like to present, and we want to make sure that we get through all of that. We also really want your questions, and we're going to leave a good bit of time at the end for a Q&A session. So if you have thoughts, questions throughout the course of the presentation, please feel free to add those into the chat, but we'll probably wait until we get near the end to answer questions. The one piece is that we might pick up during the presentation is if there's clarifying questions, something that's confusing or that you don't understand, we'll answer some of those questions as we're going through. But other than that, we'll probably hold the questions to the end. And with that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Jared.
Thanks, Cara. And thank you, everybody who is joining us today for this webinar. Really glad to be with you. Want to thank, this was a team effort by the EAN staff, this research paper. And there's also some people joining us who served as reviewers for this paper. So thank you to them as well. Before I dive in, I want to note that there's a lot more information related to this research paper, including most of the graphs that I will share in these slides today on the EAN website at eanvt.org. This presentation will also include a sneak peek of some graphs that we've been developing as part of the 2025 annual progress report for Vermont, which will not be out until the fall, but we're actively working on right now, and wanted to include a few of the new graphs we're developing that are related to this research paper. So I want to start with some high-level takeaways from this research paper. The overall flow is that I'm going to share some of the executive summary takeaways, and then we're going to walk through in a little bit more depth some of the economic analysis and then the emissions analysis. So let's start with some good news. We found, let me also just set some context. Largely what this research paper does is looks at a very valuable and important data source, which is the fossil heating fuel sales in Vermont, data that's available from the Vermont Tax Department. That is supplemented by data from VGS in terms of fossil gas or natural gas or utility gas, whatever you want to call it, sales. And for a long time, we've had access to data for gasoline and diesel sales, originally from the tax department, and then made especially accessible by the Joint Fiscal Office, or JFO. And so when we combine all of those sources, we're able to get a look at total statewide fossil fuel sales and understand how that's changing. the period of analysis that we're looking at is 2017 to 2024. It starts in 2017 because that's when the data from the tax department on fossil heating fuel sales starts. It's when it's first available. And now it goes through 2024, which is the latest full year of data that was available. So the good news when we looked at these last 8 years of fossil fuel sales data is that fossil fuel consumption has been trending downward. There's an important caveat that has been happening slowly, though, and supported largely by federal funding that is going away or facing uncertainty. It's also good news that Vermont's greenhouse gas pollution has been trending downward over the same period, as we would expect, because most of that pollution comes from the burning of fossil fuels. We estimate a 16 to 21% reduction below 2005 levels as of 2024. And a lot of this progress that we are seeing is thanks to Vermonters who are making decisions to cut pollution and often to reduce their own energy costs by, and these are all numbers as of the end of 2024, registering nearly 18,000 electric vehicles in Vermont, comprehensively weatherizing over 40,000 homes, installing over 20,000 heat pump water heaters, and installing over 70,000 cold climate heat pump units. These are all solutions that can significantly reduce fossil fuel dependence and oftentimes the costs related to fossil fuels that are often high cost and price volatile. So, and that relates to some other good news is that those opportunities that thousands of Vermonters have been taking advantage of still exist, and we can lower energy bills and provide greater price stability the more that we increase access to and adoptions of non-fossil fuel solutions, especially the fossil fuels that are particularly high cost and price volatile, such as fuel oil, propane, gasoline, and diesel. And we know that there are energy efficient solutions out there that can significantly lower monthly and lifetime costs, and that those include electric vehicles, weatherization, heat pump water heaters, heat pump systems, and advanced wood heating systems. But there is some bad news in this data and that we analyze in the report as well. 2024 was the third year in a row that statewide fossil fuel costs exceeded $2 billion. And Vermonters' exposure to and dependence on price volatile fossil fuels has led to very large cost increases in recent years. And I'm going to show that in more specificity shortly. But if you just compare the recent low with the recent high, 2020 to 2022, Vermont experienced more than $1 billion increase in annual fossil fuel costs comparing those 2 years. And that translates to a cost increase of nearly $1,800 per Vermonter. And if you just look at back-to-back years, 21 to 22, Vermont faced a 38% cost increase in fossil fuels. And this was at a time when fossil fuel consumption was staying relatively flat. And so the big change was the price volatility and the price increases. Additional news that is not on the good side is that based on this data, we find that Vermont almost certainly did not meet the first emissions reduction deadline, January 1st, 2025, which refers to 2024 annual emissions of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And based on the most recent data that is available, EAN estimates that the 2024 statewide greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont were likely between 7.75 and 8.29 million metric tons, which translates to falling 18 to 39% short of Vermont's first statewide emissions reduction obligation under the Solutions Act. So let's dive in on the economic analysis. I said that we have fossil fuel sales data through 2024, but our electricity sales data only goes through 2023. So the most recent year that we can provide an overall picture of total energy spending in Vermont is 2023. And you see how it breaks down here with electricity spending in the blue, transportation fuel spending, primarily gasoline and diesel, in the green, and then fossil heating fuel, or I should say thermal fuels spending, primarily fossil heating fuels like fuel oil and propane, in the orange. And you see that combined, that green and orange in 2023, as I said earlier, was over $2 billion, which translates to about 5% of the Vermont economy. But we do have data through 2024 for fossil fuel sales, both in the transportation side, gasoline and diesel, and on the heating side, propane, fuel oil, kerosene, and fossil gas. And this is what I was speaking to earlier. So let's start. This gray line refers to total fossil fuel consumption, which you see on this right-hand y-axis. And this is in BTUs, in trillion BTUs. And you can see how overall consumption went down in 2020, went back up a little bit, but has been relatively flat for the past 4 years. Despite that consumption being relatively flat, we've seen very large cost increases in 21 and 22, and they've stayed relatively high, over $2 billion over the last couple of years. And this was related to price spikes related to primarily fuel oil, propane, gasoline, and diesel. You can see the size, each fuel here is represented. So gasoline sales in blue, you can see how much the increases in gasoline prices increased overall fossil fuel costs to the state of Vermont, or for Vermonters. While this is showing the last 8 years of data from the tax department, this the price volatility that we see related to fossil fuels is not a recent phenomenon. This is a long-standing feature of global commodity fuel markets. This data goes back to 2005, and you can see for propane in the gray, fuel oil in the purple, this volatility, and this is adjusted for inflation, has long been a feature of fossil fuel prices that Vermonters and everybody else experiences. In contrast to some of the both generally lower cost, but also much more price stable fuels, such as electricity shown in the blue, that's in using a heat pump for heating, wood pellets in green, and fossil gas is really the fossil fuel that does not align with these higher cost, more price volatile trends that we see for fuel oil, propane, gasoline, and diesel. And it's a bit of an outlier among the fossil fuels. And so that this graph shows the comparison of different heating fuels in terms of their prices over time adjusted for inflation. This does it for transportation fuels. And you can see here too, gasoline and diesel exhibiting a lot of price volatility over the last couple of decades, and always higher cost than the equivalent cost of charging an electric vehicle. That's the statewide average electric rate. And these are EV rates offered by different utilities in Vermont that can bring that cost even lower. So let's dig in a little bit on the thermal side. So there is all sorts of ways that Vermont homes and businesses heat, from fossil gas to wood pellets to heat pumps to fuel oil to propane. And the costs that are faced by those households and businesses is going to depend on what fuel they're using. And so this breaks down average Vermont household heating fuel costs in each of the last 5 years using average heating loads and using the specific prices from those years, also adjusted for heating degree days from those years, how warm or cold the winters were. And what you see is that fuel oil and propane, again, exhibited that significant price increase and have been at a relatively higher price than some of these other heating options. If we average that 5-year period, it gets rid of the volatility, so we lose that story, but we can see on average over the last 5 years what Vermont households heating with different fuels experience for annual average costs. And propane and fuel oil were the two most expensive ways to heat homes over the last 5 years. This allows us not only to see the average annual costs as shown in blue, but can compare the greenhouse gas pollution that gets emitted from each of these heating choices on average per year as well. So not only are fuel oil and propane the two highest cost ways to heat household homes in Vermont, they are also the two most polluting, both on a direct emissions and on a total life cycle emissions basis, including upstream emissions, which are shown in the lighter orange there. So one of the things that we wanted to do is say, okay, well, what does this mean for a specific household? And because different households have different situations, use different costs, this is a specific example of a Vermont home that uses fuel oil for heating, a furnace, a forced hot air system. And say this household also has two gasoline vehicles, and average electricity costs. So over the last 5 years, what would household costs look like for that household using these numbers and these averages? And what you see is a really significant energy cost increase, combining heating, transportation, and electric costs for this example household. If we zoom in, and most of that change is in the fossil fuel prices, the electricity prices, total costs were staying fairly stable for this household. But if let's zoom in on the fossil fuel portion for heating and for transportation. Again, this assumes a fuel oil furnace and two gasoline cars. This would have been the type of cost increase that a Vermont household faced from 21 to 2022, about $2,500 in extra costs, which is incredibly significant. More than a 50% increase in costs in just that 1 year period. And we know that these cost increases are not felt equally, and that even though lower income Vermonters on average use less energy and spend less on energy, as you can see in these blue bars, lower incomes shown on the left, higher incomes shown on the right, the share of income that energy spending takes up out of a household budget is much higher for lower income Vermonters than it is for upper income Vermonters. So these price spikes are felt especially acutely for lower income folks who have high energy cost burdens. One of the ways that these costs can be avoided or reduced is by using less energy to achieve the same tasks. Not only is it the case that electricity is generally more price stable and lower cost as a transportation fuel or a heating fuel with electric vehicles or with heat pump water heaters or heat pumps, it's also true that it uses far less energy to accomplish the same task than internal combustion does, either to move a vehicle or to heat a home. And this is something that is such an important part of this story, is that for a long time, the way that we have traveled around, the way that we've heated spaces is through internal combustion. And that combustion is usually with fossil fuels is incredibly inefficient. Let's look at the right-hand side here. In a gas vehicle, if you look at all of the energy that is put in terms of gasoline, on average, only 16 to 25% of that energy actually ends up being delivered to the wheels and moving a vehicle. Most of that energy input is lost in the form of heat and other engine losses. But because of the efficiency of electric motors and modern electric vehicles, we can see 3 to 4 times the amount of energy efficiency, where most of that electricity that's put in the vehicle actually results, 87 to 91% of that energy ends up being delivered to the wheels and moving the vehicle, such that for the same amount of energy input, you can move an electric vehicle about 3 to 4 miles that would move a gas vehicle only 1 mile. And we know that on the heating side, on the left, that combustion technologies are capped at 100% efficiency. You cannot get more efficient than 100% of the energy input turned into heat when you're burning something to produce heat. But with heat pumps, heat is transferred from one place to the other using heat pump technology, which allows you to achieve efficiencies on average far above 100%. So this is another way that you can get more out of your energy, which means using less energy for the same task and oftentimes enabling significant price savings. So this is an example of what that looks like with water heating. So on average, so the orange here shows a propane water heater, and that upfront is usually on average less expensive to purchase and install. But because a propane water heater is less efficient and its fuel is more expensive, over time, annually and over the life of that water heater, the lifetime costs on average are estimated to be about $9,500 for a propane water heater. And although it is on average more expensive upfront to purchase and install a heat pump water heater, you're then using a piece of equipment that's more efficient and using a lower cost fuel, so that your annual costs for fuel are much lower, and you can get to lifetime costs that are $3,000 less than the propane water heater. This range, the reason we're showing a range here, is that what the upfront cost of a heat pump water heater is will depend on incentives. There are some federal incentives, some state incentives, some utility incentives. Depending on income, the cost of a new heat pump water heater can be brought down to zero. But even if it's not, we're looking at average, and this is for a single family home. This is not in a multifamily context. That's an important point because those are different scenarios. But in a single family home, average lifetime savings from a heat pump water heater of about $3,000 compared to a propane water heater, again, because of these better efficiencies and the lower costs and greater price stability of electricity versus propane and other fossil fuels. This is a look at what this translates to on the transportation side. So again, we're looking at an apples to apples comparison of a gas Chevy Equinox versus an electric Chevy Equinox. And we see that the upfront cost without any incentives of the EV is higher, as shown in this green bar, than the upfront MSRP, the sticker price of the gas Equinox. But then when you calculate the operations and maintenance costs in purple and the fuel costs, either for gasoline on the left or for electricity on the right, we see average lifetime savings even before incentives that may be available for the electric vehicle, average lifetime savings of about $5,800. Again, because of the efficiency advantages of electric vehicles over internal combustion engines and gas vehicles, and because of the generally lower costs of electricity. So when we plug in the numbers of the average mileage that Vermonters drive, recent prices for electricity and gasoline, the AAA data in terms of costs per mile of maintenance, we're looking at potential savings on fuel and maintenance over the lifetime of the vehicle of about $9,500 for electric vehicles as opposed to gas vehicles. And so the reason I wanted to talk through this is not just to present the problem of $2 billion a year on fossil fuel, these massive price spike, the cost increases that Vermonters are facing for energy because of our continued reliance on high cost and price volatile fossil fuel. but that now over the last decade, we have the technologies available to help get off of those roller coaster cost curves that we've been exposed to and dependent on with fossil fuels for decades, and get onto lower cost, more price stable curves that can save Vermonters money year after year and over the lifetime of that equipment, whether it's a vehicle or a piece of heating equipment. This is an example we put together looking at a single family household that heats with propane and that has 2 gas cars, looking at their current energy bill all in. I mean, there's not one energy bill, right? You might pay for gas at the pump every couple of weeks. You might pay your propane bill once or twice a year. You might pay your electric bill monthly. But all of those together are your annual energy costs. And if we are able to help increase the accessibility and overcome the upfront cost barriers through incentives to help people electrify, then we can move to a situation like this where, yes, the overall electricity bill would go up if we're using electricity for heating and transportation rather than just for lighting and appliances, but that the overall energy costs are going down because of getting off of what you see in the purple and the orange gasoline and propane. So this is just one example. I think it's really important to underline that this is an average statewide average electric utility costs. These savings could be higher or lower depending on your electric utility and your rates. And similarly, the savings could be higher or lower if you're in a different situation than is shown on the left. You wouldn't see the same savings if you're currently heating with fossil gas. You might see more savings if the fuel mix was different. But just picking out this specific example to show that it is possible to durably reduce energy bills by taking advantage of lower cost energy and more energy efficient technology. There's also a really important factor here when we look at the statewide economy, and that is that 100% of the fossil fuel that we use in Vermont is imported. We don't produce any of it here. And most of the cost that is bound up in that fossil fuel is related to the commodity itself. There's a small share of money that we spend on fossil fuel that goes to local fuel dealers, gas stations, and their drivers, but most of that money immediately goes out of state to pay for the imported fuel product. And that's a different situation than we see on the electricity side, where a much larger share of our energy dollars stay and recirculate locally, because most of the cost of electricity is related to activity that happens in Vermont. Line workers, tree trimming, customer service operations, power purchases, and even when those power purchases are not in Vermont, and many of them for Vermont's electricity portfolio are out of state, they are still much more regional than the dollars that flow to the multinational fossil fuel corporations in different countries, from the Middle East to Russia to South America, a global market, whereas our electricity market, even when those dollars aren't staying in Vermont, they may be going to New York or Maine or Quebec. So that's the emissions overview. I want to take 10 minutes to do the emissions analysis as well. The context here is that Vermont has a Global Warming Solutions Act that set obligations for the state to reduce emissions in line with science-based targets that reflect the United States commitment as part of the Paris Climate Agreement. So you see those commitments in the blue dots here, here, and here. You see our historical emissions in the darker, bolder color from 1990 through 2021. And one of the challenges of this is everything from 1990 to 2021 is data from the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources greenhouse gas inventory. And a challenge with the inventory is that it is often on a 3-year time lag, because some of the data that is necessary for it is not available right away. Most specifically, the agricultural emissions data, which are calculated using an Environmental Protection Agency or EPA tool that it has this time lag. But we know that our two largest emitting sectors, transportation, as shown in the green, and the thermal sector, as shown in the orange, thanks to this tax department data and the VGS data, we're able to get a sense of what has historically been 70% of our emissions, not 3 years later, but within a month in near real time. And so we took this fossil fuels sales data to say, okay, we can't estimate the entire statewide emissions with that, but we can say what is likely happening with the two largest emitting sectors, and then what would be plausible for the other sectors. So before I dive into how we did that and what the results were, I want to just set a little bit more context, putting Vermont's emissions in context. And here, like I started with earlier, there's kind of different ways of looking at this, and you might say good news or bad news. I think the good news is that Vermont's emissions have long been and still are significantly lower than average per capita emissions in the United States. However, when we compare ourselves globally, they are more than twice as high per capita as the global average. And we have, as of 2021, which is the latest comparable data between all New England states, we have the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions of any state in New England at 12.8 million metric tons. We have also, since 2005, that key baseline as part of the Paris Agreement, as part of our Global Warming Solutions Act, as part of many other states' Global Warming Solutions Act or their equivalents, we have seen, we've achieved a 16% decline as of 2021 in emissions, which is the lowest percentage decline of any state in New England. So whether we look at per capita emissions, whether we look at the overall decline, we know that if we want to be doing our part towards science-based commitments, then we have a lot more work to do to reduce climate pollution here in Vermont. So what we did with the fossil fuel sales data is to look at what would be the proportional share of emissions reduction or overall emissions or emissions reduction that we would need to see in that sector for it to be on track. And the Climate Council established kind of reference points for emissions reduction by sector. And so if the transportation sector was kind of doing its fair share, its proportional share of emissions reduction towards the first emissions reduction obligation of the Global Warming Solutions Act, we would have wanted to see 2024 annual transportation emissions at no higher than 2.92 million metric tons. Instead, based on this data from the tax department and JFO, that our estimate using the appropriate emissions factors, the same assumptions and methodology that is used for the greenhouse gas inventory that the state produces, an estimate of 3.21 million metric tons in the transportation sector. So coming in over where we would have wanted to be. Similarly, coming in over on the thermal sector emissions, although not as far over. So 2.28 million metric tons would have been the target for that sector to be on track for its proportional share of reduction for this first emissions reduction deadline. We are estimating instead 2.37 million metric tons. And so when you combine those two numbers versus you see 5.57 million metric tons. The combined target for those two sectors was 5.2. And so we've got this overage, this excess emissions above where we would have wanted to be by about 370,000 metric tons. And so if we were to meet the overall statewide emissions reduction target, we would need to see emissions reduction in the remaining sectors even more than what their proportional targets would have been. So their proportional targets for all other sectors, non-transportation, non-thermal, would have been 2.1. But to make up for the excess emissions that we see in the transportation and thermal sectors, all other sectors would actually now need to be down to 1.72 for 2024. And the problem is that there's no plausible reason to think that that could have or would have happened, because in the most recent years of data, the three largest emitting sectors after transportation and thermal, agriculture, industrial processes, and waste management, have all been relatively flat or increasing in recent years. And so what we did was to say, we don't yet know what the emissions in those sectors are, but to develop a very plausible and a very conservative range, we're going to look at what were the maximum changes in emissions in those sectors over the past 3 years of data from the inventory, and then assume the maximum emissions from those sectors would be that maximum change that we saw in any period over the last 3 years, or that it could come in even lower than that. So adding that maximum difference up and subtracting it down to get a plausible range for how these emissions from these other sectors may have moved. And we see this often for inventory forecasts that Vermont has done, where values are carried forward and then presented in a plausible range. And when we do that and combine it with our estimates for the transportation and thermal sector, we end up with a plausible estimate of somewhere between 7.75 and 8.29 million metric tons of statewide climate pollution, which even in a best case scenario would be 450,000 tons higher than what the legal obligation was for 2024 emissions under the Solutions Act. But I want to come back to some good news, that even though it is almost certain that Vermont failed to meet the first emissions reduction obligation of the Global Warming Solutions Act, when we look around the country and the world, we are seeing that other states and provinces are managing to meet their commitment, and they're doing it with proven policies and regulation that can reduce energy costs while reducing pollution. It's really important to point out that the fact that Vermont did not meet our first obligation is not because it was not possible to do so. It's because emissions don't, unfortunately, just go down on their own. The states that have succeeded in reducing emissions, meeting their targets and requirements, have implemented policies, not just on one sector, but on multiple energy sectors to reduce pollution and reduce costs. And so just because we almost certainly did not meet the first obligation does not mean that it's not possible to meet future obligations, but it will almost certainly require the adoption of policies and regulations that can cut pollution and cut costs, not just in the electricity sector, where Vermont has seen a lot of activity on the policy and regulatory front, but on the elephants in the room in terms of where most of the cost and most of the pollution is in terms of fossil fuels used for transportation and heating. And in the places that are adopting these multi-sector or economy-wide policy approaches, Washington, Oregon, California, Maryland, Quebec, there is a greater opportunity to reduce emissions. And I'll just give the example of, this is a very different graph than we see for Vermont, where California not only was able to meet its 2020 target, it was able to come in under it about 6 years early because of a comprehensive economy-wide policy approach that aimed to reduce emissions, not just from its electricity sector, but also from the transportation and thermal sectors. So I'm going to end by, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that the actual data is available in an appendix at the end of the report. So you can see the sales volumes for propane, fuel oil, fossil gas, and then converted to total heating fuel sales based on a common BTU basis. That's in the report. This is the data directly from the tax department and VGS. And then we also provide the same data on the transportation side if folks want to dig any further. And there's the link, which I think has also been put in the chat for the paper. But at this point, I think I'm going to stop share and we'll go over to the questions.
All right. So we do have one question in the chat. Nathaniel is asking, what's to say that electricity won't become the more price volatile energy source in the future?
I think that's a good and fair question. This is really looking at the historical data. I think that for Vermont, it's likely a different analysis than other places because largely because the way that our electricity sector is regulated, it allows for long-term contracts to be in place that provide greater price stability. Now, that's not to say we're living in very uncertain, unpredictable kind of geopolitical times, and there is more tension now between our federal government and Canada and the Canadian provinces than I can remember in my lifetime. So I think it's a fair question. We should not always assume that what has happened over the last few decades will necessarily continue. But certainly all the data that we have to date has shown that electricity costs and prices in Vermont have been much more price stable than the the global commodity fossil fuel market.
And I just said this in the chat, but if anyone else has questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or you can just go ahead and raise your hand.
And if there was a question on a specific graph or number or piece of analysis, happy to pull that back up and go back to it.
Oh, Linda, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Jared. As usual, you guys have come up with very, very good, um, uh, good, solid analyses that make a lot of sense, and you present them very clearly. So, because you present them so clearly, it seems to me like much of the beginning numbers and data that you had comprise a very, very good overall answer to the political question of affordability of making this transition. And so I just want to encourage you all to like just spread the word or work with other groups to spread the word as much as you can because you know just the numbers that you had, for example, per household are are pretty solid. And it's like, I think if average people understood that, they would be saying, hey, why why aren't there policies to help me make this transition faster? Anyway, thank you. That's
Thank you, Linda, for that encouragement. And yeah, I will just say that I think that the energy affordability conversation, it's really important to ground that in what we mean by affordability and how kind of narrowly or broadly we talk about it. I think oftentimes in the kind of political conversation and in the media, what is meant by affordability is, does it cost something to change, or what is the upfront cost of moving from fossil fuel-based equipment to cleaner and more efficient electric equipment? I think it's equally important that when we talk about affordability, we look at the costs of the status quo, because I think that there's this kind of baked in assumption that if we don't do anything, that's somehow affordable. And I think that this recent fossil fuel sales data shows how wrong that is, how if we do not change anything, then people get exposed to these billion-dollar plus price cost increases at a statewide level, $2,500 per household, because of the price spikes and the higher costs of fossil fuels. And so I think we need to look at not just the costs of the transition, but the costs of the status quo. And I think we also need to look at not just what is the upfront cost of changing or choosing a different vehicle or piece of equipment, but what are the annual and lifetime costs to operate and maintain and fuel the different pieces of equipment, so we can get that bigger picture view. But even when you do that, I think that there are a lot of people who understand and like academically are interested in this idea of, oh, I would love to pay less money year after year and have lifetime cost savings, but I can't afford that piece of equipment, which is why it's so important that there's well-designed policy to provide incentives to lower and middle income folks. Otherwise, we run the risk of creating an even greater divergence between upper income and lower income folks, where the folks who can afford to get on lower cost energy solutions are just the wealthier folks who can afford those upfront costs, and lower income folks are left on this high cost fossil fuel roller coaster. So I do hope that we can move to an affordability conversation that is more complete than just this question of, what does it cost to change? It's also, what is it costing us right now, and what are the potential savings of that change?
So there is one comment in the chat from Anne. It says, your EV charger data seems to diverge from a friend's recent experience trying to buy an EV. She wanted badly to buy one, but ground charging stations or public charging stations were few and poorly maintained. I think this is a really good point for folks who don't have access to charging at home, but I'm wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the differences in charging options and how that could become more accessible in the future.
Yeah, it's a really important point that depending on where you live, either your electricity territory, and whether you have at-home charging, or say you're a renter that doesn't have access to off-street parking, or at-home EV charging, and you're more dependent on public charging, the costs can be very different, either by utility territory or by your living situation. So the example that we showed, it could be higher or lower than that. But the example we showed was charging at the statewide average residential rate. It could be lower than that if you have access to at-home charging and an EV rate like Green Mountain Power or Burlington Electric offers. But if you don't have access to even just regular residential rate for charging, and have to charge at public charging stations that charge more and maybe down, may have different fees to access, then those average costs could go up. So I think that this is another area where policy is really important in terms of accessibility and equity. It's been really encouraging and interesting to see Burlington, for instance, pilot projects where there are pole-mounted chargers that can drop down for folks to charge who are often renters and don't have access to off-street parking. But for folks who do have access to off-street parking, who can charge in their garage, for instance, most of the experience is that, the vast majority, over 95% of vehicle charging happens at the home, and that public charging is usually happening primarily on longer trips or road trips.
Yeah, thanks. Another question in the chat from Olivia. I'm wondering if you can outline a bit more of what pathways do seem most viable for Vermont to follow to look more like California, Quebec, Maryland, etc., especially when we've seen the resistance programs like the Clean Heat Standard generate even before they get off the ground.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. I want to be clear that EAN as a nonprofit organization doesn't take policy positions for or against different policy proposals that have been or that may be before the legislature. But just from a data and information perspective, if you take an example like California that has met and come in under its emissions reduction targets, they will credit the fact that they have an economy-wide cap on emissions. So in Vermont, we have a cap on emissions from the electricity sector by participating in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And our electricity sector emissions in Vermont are only about, I think the latest data was about 3%. I would have to double check that, but I think it's about 3% of our total statewide emissions, whereas transportation and thermal are about 70% of our emissions. So we've put a cap on 3% of our emissions, but no cap on 70% of our emissions. In California, in Quebec, in Oregon, in Washington, they have put in caps on all more economy-wide or on multiple sectors in all of that fossil fuel use. They have also implemented performance standards on fossil fuel importers, clean fuel standards in Oregon, Washington, and California, also called low carbon fuel standards. And they will point not just to one or the other of these policies, but the complementary effect of emissions cap and invest programs, and performance standards on the fuel sectors as together being responsible for achieving not just declines in emissions, but providing revenue to then directly rebate to lower income customers. Like, for instance, in California, they provide utility bill rebates so that energy costs can go down for folks. And those are the type of policies that are being discussed right now by the Vermont Climate Council, looking at ways that Vermont policy recommendations that Vermont could consider that could both reduce climate pollution while also reducing costs, especially for lower and middle income folks. There's a number of recommendations under consideration, but one of them is a cap and invest policy similar to what California, Quebec, and Washington have done, and that New York is considering.
Thanks, Jared. Thank you to everyone who have put questions in the chat so far. We can wrap up a few minutes early, but if anyone else has any final questions, feel free to come off mute. All right. Hearing none, I think we'll close out a few minutes early. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good.